Many of you heard me say that Black history is celebrated 365 days a year, and February is actually our anniversary, in which we actually do programs and have cultural as well as educational sessions. Today, our committee is really delighted to have Mr. Marvin-Alonzo Greer, who serves as the lead historic interpretation and community engagement officer for Prince George's County, Maryland's Park and Planning Commission. His flagship project is the curation and development of a county Sankofa mobile museum. When launched, the museum will travel around the DMV using history to teach social activism and helping children and families have a better understanding of how they can make meaningful impacts on their communities. A native of Pasadena, California, Marvin-Alonzo grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, where he graduated from Morehouse, with a BA in history and a minor in African American studies. He has held leadership and managerial roles at museums and historical institutions, including the Atlanta History Center, Colonial Williamsburg, the Missouri Historical Society's Soldier Memorial Military Museum in St. Louis. His community activism and partnership with community organizations to place neighborhoods in historical context led him to being aware of the to be awarded the Emancipation Proclamation Award for preserving African American history and culture by the city of Atlanta. Marvin-Alonzo uses his social media profile, MAG, the historian, MAG, the historian, to teach Black history and has partnered with PBS, Ancestry.com, and Google for Creators for various social media campaigns. In 2021, Marvin-Alonzo was profiled by the People's Magazine as Black activists, artists, historians, and change makers you should follow on social media. You all hear that? Follow him on social media. MAG, the historian. When he is not working, Marvin-Alonzo is a mentor and big brother to living historians and historical interpreters. He co-founded the Sons and Daughters of Ham. This is a civilian organization, and the Hannibal Guards military, two living history organizations dedicated to interpreting the lives of Black people in the Civil War. Under his leadership, the Sons and Daughters of Ham were recognized by the National Park Service with the National Capital Region Hartzog Awards for Excellence in Group Volunteering. Oh, you fit right in Greenbelt, because that's all we do is volunteer. Marvin-Alonzo's central belief is to use history as medicine by connecting communities to their past and creating honest dialogues across cultures that will inspire communities to actions. I also want to mention that tomorrow from 12 to 3, Marvin-Alonzo will be at the Riversdale Museum actually doing the cooking demonstrations of the foods he's going to speak about today. So if you have time to get over to the Riversdale Museum between 12 and 3 tomorrow, you can actually see some of the ways that he's going to be demonstrating the food that he's doing today. We're going to ask everyone to please turn off their videos and mute themselves while he is speaking. You can put any questions that you have in the chat, and Mashana will make sure they get called out. Okay, thank you very much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome Marvin-Alonzo Greer.
Thank you, Dr. Rosado. It's an honor to be here and partner with my community partners at Greenbelt. And thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint real quick. And everyone should be able to see that. Leanne, I can see your face. Could you give me a thumbs up if you can see my PowerPoint? You can. Awesome. Excellent.
Yes, good.
Excellent. Thank you. So again, my name is Marvin-Alonzo Greer, and I work for Prince George's County Parks. I've been cooking using open hearth style cooking the way our ancestors would have done for probably the past almost 20 years or so, using the same techniques, the same styles that our ancestors would have done in the 18th and 19th centuries. That's the 1700s, 1800s, and also even part of the 20th century. And then also members of the world around us today still cook and using some of these same techniques. So today we'll be talking about feeding the body, healing the soul, foodways of enslaved people. How Africans and African Americans throughout American history have used food as a way of resistance, preserving their own legacies, history, and culture, and really creating what we know today as American foodways. I want to start off with this quote from Ira Berlin on why it's important to discuss race and African American history and enslavement when it comes to discussing broader American history. Ira Berlin says, simply put, American history cannot be understood without slavery. Slavery shaped America's economy, politics, culture, and the fundamental principles. For most of the nation's history, American society was one of slaveholders and slaves. That being said, although the topic of enslavement can be considered uncomfortable for those who are descendants of enslaved people, as well as those who are descendants of enslavers. I think that comes because we don't talk about enslavement from a sense of survival and resistance. Oftentimes we talk about enslavement from a story of victimization, but focusing on food and foodways is really going to help us understand the strength and the legacy that our enslaved ancestors preserved from their African roots, carried through to today, and that shapes America, and the America that not just Black Americans, but all Americans and people around the world can really benefit from. But before enslavement, we have to really talk about who are some of these individuals that are coming to what becomes British North America, the Spanish Caribbean and Spanish North America, the French Caribbean, and the French North America. And those individuals are coming from three primary regions that had many empires that were often left out of our history books. We have the region of Ethiopia, and there was a number of kingdoms and empires there. The Bantu states, where lots of enslaved people are eventually shipped from, like Angola, Congo, and those regions. And there was numerous empires there. And then most heavily, the Western imperial system. And you can see all of the different empires that existed in these areas. These areas are very unique in their leadership styles. Most had some kind of written language. Most had very unique, or all had very unique foodways and food systems, and all of these would eventually be incorporated into the American dietary system. The slave trade begins in the 1400s, and with the Portuguese and the Spanish, when they decide to travel west and try to explore, trying to find Asia, a shorter route to Asia, but instead stumble upon the Caribbean, later on South Central America, and then later on North America. With that, obviously, there's the boom of the slave trade, where millions of Africans, around 10 million Africans, are forcibly brought from Africa to North, South, Central America and the Caribbean, as well as more being taken to Asia. A few more have been taken to Asia and Europe. With them, these individuals are not coming, they may be coming empty-handed, but they're not coming empty-headed. So they're bringing their culture, their religions, their foodways with them in this on these voyages. So through the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans are bringing with them, as well as enslavers on these slave ships, are bringing foods to feed these enslaved Africans and seeds. So black-eyed peas, okra, kidney beans, lima beans, many of these things we think of today as being very American foods. You may have them in your own homes today, or you may have them on special occasions. These are all dishes that come, or foods that come from Africa, and that we see today, and that were incorporated into America's dietary system. One of my favorites personally is peanuts. As a person who grew up in Georgia, one of the a term I learned at an early age was the word goober, or goober peas. I know my teachers used to say this word, and as a child, I was like, I don't know what that means. And they taught me that peanut. And so I just thought it was a very Southern way of saying peanut, American slang. But goobers, or peanuts, actually originate in the Americas, in either Brazil or Peru, but definitely South America. And through the Columbian Exchange, were taken from South America to Africa. They spread widely throughout Africa, were then taken to Europe, spread widely throughout Europe, were also then taken to Asia. So peanuts are widely popular throughout the world, but come from South and Central America. However, they don't reach North America until after enslaved people from Africa are being brought from the west coast of Africa to British North America. It was brought by this, peanuts were transported by the Spanish, but again, it was the British and the slave trade that really brings these peanuts or goobers to British North America. That being said, as Africans, mainly from the Congo, so one of those Bantu language speaking people, are what they called peanuts or ground nuts. They called it nguba, which obviously that term is translated again eventually into the term goober or goober peas. And so you even see songs in the 19th century called goober peas. And so not only are Africanisms being transported in the way of the food that Americans are eating, but also the words that Americans would be using. So you see words like goober, which is a translation of the Congolese word nguba, meaning groundnut or peanut. Watermelons. Watermelons again can be traced back to Southern Africa. They were used throughout Southern Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, and even the Middle East as ways of supplying water for people, especially when you came to large deserts where there was no water supplies. Africans found that watermelons could grow in inhospitable climates, and so people could also transport them over long distances and use those as a supply of water and nutrients. They first reach the Americas around 1576, but we definitely know that they were in Massachusetts, so a British colony, by 1629. They were again, we don't know if they were brought over by enslavers or if the seeds were brought by enslaved people and eventually cultivated them. Watermelons were sold both before and after enslavement by enslaved people to free people, to white people, to enslavers. We do know that Thomas Jefferson grew watermelons on his properties, and he's growing them. He's actually not actually growing them. The enslaved people on the property are growing these watermelons for themselves, for Jefferson and his guests, as well as for themselves and other enslaved people to sell. Now, oftentimes watermelons are associated with stereotypes that we see throughout the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and even into the 21st century, where watermelons used to lampoon and make fun of Black people through racist caricatures. These stereotypes actually come from the mid and late 19th century, usually post-emancipation, so post-1865, where free people of color, free African Americans have especially people that are just out of enslavement, have very limited ways of exercising economic freedom. They can farm on their own, for the most part, oftentimes farming on the land that was they previously lived on under in enslavement, or they're sharecroppers and tenant farmers. That being said, those some of the fruits and vegetables they're growing, they're going to sell at market. Watermelon are one of those fruits. Watermelon has been used historically to lampoon people of a lower socioeconomic level. It was used to, in the British, used watermelons to make fun of and caricature people that were from Greece, people that were from the Middle East, especially Arabs and Italians. They saw that these individuals would, in Europe, would eat watermelon. They would throw the rinds on the ground. And so they really kind of poked fun at these individuals for being less civilized, dirty. And so that's really where this caricature of watermelons came from. And that same bigotry was transported to the United States in the post-Civil War era to really push back and fight back against Black economic achievements using the sale of watermelon. So to combat that, unfortunately, Black people, for a large proportion, stopped selling watermelon because they were trying to associate and assimilate to a white-dominated society and really garner themselves towards respectability politics. So even to this day, there are some African Americans who don't want to be seen eating watermelon publicly, and there's still a lot of stereotypes regarding Black people and watermelons. But we do know that watermelons do come from Africa, and that's, again, that cultural survival of incorporating native fruits and vegetables native to Africa into the American dietary system. And you can actually see watermelons in some hieroglyphics from the Egyptians. Okra. So anyone from New Orleans or who's ever had gumbo is probably very familiar with okra. That dates back to ancient Egypt and Ethiopia, going back for centuries. That being said, okra was transported in again on the slave trade, both in Africa and here in the colonies, and then later on the United States. Enslaved people and Africans were roasting okra seeds and okra pods over a fire, and they would use that to make coffee. So if you don't want to go to Starbucks, you can always buy some okra and try to make your own. I've not had it yet, but that's definitely something that I'm going to try in the future. Okra was introduced to the Americas, both the Caribbean, South and Central America, and the North America in the 17th century, so around the 1600s. And it was documented as far north as Philadelphia by the 18th century, 1740. We don't really know where the term okra comes from, where the term gumbo comes from specifically, or the term okra. But we have some clues based on both Native American, specifically Choctaw, and African words. So you can see the word for okra comes from, well, looking at the Choctaw word kuombo, you can see that sounds kind of like gumbo. And then the Angolan word ngombo, which again is for okra. So you might say that might also sound like the word gumbo. And then the word okra itself is an Igbo word, okuru. So you can see how, again, Africanisms and languages that are outside of the British or the European lexicons are incorporated into the American systems. So whether gumbo comes from a Choctaw word or an Angolan word, we don't know, but we definitely know it was not a European or French design, as well as even the word okra coming from the Igbo people who are located today what's mostly Nigeria. Okra was also used as a form of resistance, physical resistance by enslaved people. Not only would they grow it and sell it and eat it, we do know that it's highly documented that sexual assaults were commonplace amongst enslaved women. And it's not just in the 20th and 21st century that women want to control their bodies and their reproductive rights. It's documented that some enslaved women used the okra plant, primarily the slime, the sap that's inside of the okra, to induce abortions, to be able to control their own reproductive rights. Black-eyed peas. I know that many have association with black-eyed peas, not just for everyday eating, but for special holidays, especially on New Year's. Black-eyed peas actually comes from Asia, and they were brought to, they spread widely through West Africa and the African continent, and then eventually to the Americas and the West Indies, and then later on to the United States, as early as the 1600s. We do know that these were served on slaving vessels, so they would be mashed up and made into kind of mush and either fed or force-fed to enslaved Africans. But it was these beans were easy to grow. They were something that enslaved people could grow on their own personal gardens that took a little tending to. It just took a few seeds. They would sprout. If you created a trellis, you would have to water them, but they really are self-sufficient, and so allowed for a low work but high yield product for our African ancestors and enslaved African ancestors to produce when you're doing other tasks around a farm, a plantation, or your village. Now, one of the biggest controversies that people, or confusions that people have, is yams. I know growing up, I was always told we're having yams for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, but by yams, we in the United States refer to yams as sweet potatoes. They are not the same thing. Sweet potatoes do come from the United States. When they come to the United States, they were cultivated heavily by Native Americans. However, when enslaved Africans are brought to the United States, they're not bringing very many root vegetables with them. The enslaving vessels are not really bringing that many rooted vegetables or tubers with them. But these enslaved Africans do see things like these sweet potatoes, and they remind them of yams. And so that's where that term comes from, is seeing something similar to what you eat back home, and then and giving it that name. That being said, we get the word yam from nyami, which comes from a different African dialect, and so that's where the word actually comes from. But yams are different in texture, they're different in taste, they're different in size, and really they are in the same family, but they have absolutely nothing in like taste-wise or preparation-wise in common. You can still get today in the throughout the United States, go to farmers markets, things of that nature. But Africa still produces the most, I think it might be Nigeria specifically, but produces the most yams in the in the entire world. Poultry. So although something that that were not brought to the United States necessarily by enslaved Africans, they were chickens specifically were heavily dominated by the enslaved population. It is known that both enslaved people and free people were the general chicken merchants during the 18th and 19th century. They sold the birds themselves, they sold eggs, they sold feathers, they sold the meat. So whatever you wanted, if you were an enslaver, if you were a free white person, or even a free black person, you didn't necessarily raise chickens yourself, you could go to the market, you could barter, and you can make deals with enslaved people who may have been at the market selling their chickens. In Virginia and most slaveholding states, which in the 18th century was all the colonies were practiced the institution of slavery, but in Virginia specifically, Virginia legislature made it illegal for enslaved people to own most livestock. And so that really gave only fowl or birds as a way of selling. If you're going to sell animals, of selling things. George Washington, we note, prevented his enslaved community from selling certain birds, but it did allow for the selling. He did allow for the selling of chickens to himself and to other people that are visiting Mount Vernon and his other various properties. And then we do know that Thomas Jefferson as well paid his enslaved people for these birds. So we can see that enslaved people are using what systems they can as a way of resistance, which is quite ironic because enslavers technically they own the human body, so they would own enslaved people. Even if enslaved people owned that chicken technically would be owned by the enslaver. But enslavers tended to, not always, still respect this idea of property ownership by enslaved people. And so enslaved people were able to exercise their autonomy by selling of poultry and other birds. That being said, if you were enslaved, you could, in many instances, not all, you could sometimes purchase your freedom. So by being able to sell fruits, vegetables, poultry, this carved out a way for enslaved individuals to purchase their freedom. Purchase the freedom, if you're free, purchasing the freedom of a loved one, or purchasing a loved one and having them as your enslaved person as a way of protecting them. Or if you know you may not be able to become free, it also gives you an opportunity maybe to buy something nice for your loved one, your wife, your husband, your parents, your children. And so really creating a way out of no way and carving out community for yourself and your family. Now, rice doesn't really grow in our region here in the mid-Atlantic states, but even though it has been attempted here historically. But rice is very big in Georgia and South Carolina. Rice was successfully cultivated throughout Africa, especially West Africa and Asia, and was first introduced to Virginia in 1609. And then later in South Carolina in 1685. If you've heard of Carolina gold rice, that is the rice that is descended from this rice from Madagascar, gold seed rice that was introduced to the colonies in 1685. There was many attempts for European colonizers to try to grow rice. It was mainly unsuccessful until they really started leaning on enslaved people, enslaved Africans from rice growing locations. And those enslaved individuals really taught Europeans how to properly cultivate rice here in the colonies. And that way is still being done today. So things like groundwater springs, soil moisture reservations are all things that Africans taught Europeans during the colonial times and are still being taught to this very day. Oftentimes we talk about enslaved people as being property, not being humans, not coming over with any kind of skills. But our ancestors of the 18th and 19th century really proved that enslaved people, and even said it kind of in their advertisements, that enslaved people knew what they were doing. These are two ads for the sale of enslaved people. And you'll notice in the ad on the left, from the 18th century, it says Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. They're not saying the rice coast just for giggles. They are letting you know these individuals come from the rice coast of Africa, which means that these individuals know how to harvest and sell, harvest and grow rice. So if you buy individuals from these areas, that's what you're like. That's someone you might want to go to. And the next ad is from the 19th century. Again, long cotton and rice Negroes. Again, they're letting you know that these individuals know how to grow rice. So if you are looking for a skilled laborer to do those things, then this is where you need to buy enslaved people from. It's the same way today that if you go to, if you're trying to have your car repaired, you're not going to go to an art supply store, because art supply stores obviously don't specialize in mechanics. Although you may find someone there who can fix your car, that's not where you're going to go. And enslavers knew the exact same thing. They knew there were specific regions of Africa where people specialized in different things, and they did exactly that. Now, once enslaved people come to the colonies, and later in the United States, not only are they working in the agricultural fields, they're also working inside the house. They are laundresses, they are cooks, they are waiting men and waiting women. They are waking these enslavers up. They are putting them to bed, they're bathing them, they're doing their hair. Anything you would do today in your own home, from cooking to bathing to dressing to doing the hair, was all done by enslaved people in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And cooking was obviously one of those jobs. Cooks actually had a lot of power on plantations. They were usually considered higher ranking in the ranking system of enslaved people. They usually had a little bit more freedom of movement, usually not always, but freedom of movement. They had more access to the enslaver and their families, which was not necessarily always a good thing. Historically, when we talk about enslavement, people talk about people working in the house versus people working in the fields. It's not an Olympics of suffering. There's no such thing as a good or better position on a plantation or on a farm. No matter what your job was on a plantation or a farm, you were still enslaved. You were still barred from having your family with you. You were still barred from having equal rights. You were still owned and considered someone's chattel property. That being said, enslaved cooks could also navigate better treatment from their enslavers, because they're, again, the ones dealing with the food. And so you can imagine if that enslaver is overly harsh, is extremely cruel, that enslaved cook has a lot of power to do things to their food, whether it's poisoning or sabotaging food. And we do know that there were enslaved people who did that. A young girl in Prince George's County, she poisoned her enslavers' children and killed them all. I don't know if she was a cook or not, but again, having access to food and to the food of your enslavers is a power that you have. And enslaved cooks also had the ability to escape and liberate themselves, like this young lady named Rachel, who was enslaved by a man named Mr. Hardiman, and she was a cook. And we know she escaped. She liberated herself by escaping from this runaway ad. That being said, we don't know what happened to her, where she went. We hope that she was able to escape, but her escape would have been even more possible and successful because she had that skilled trade. She could cook. She could be hired out. She could open her own kitchen, possibly, if she made it to a place that practiced abolition and was anti-slavery. So cooks who liberated themselves had that ability to, or at least an easier time selling their abilities to gain employment. Another person who escaped enslavement and liberated themselves was a man named Hercules Posey. And unfortunately, this image right here is actually not him. This is an image that is located in Spain, but for many years it has been thought that this was Hercules Posey, but it is not. Mr. Posey was George Washington's chef. He was first enslaved by one of Washington's neighbors, and who owed Washington money. He defaulted on his loan, and so Washington took Posey as collateral. So enslaved people were again put up as collateral and used as such by banks, by humans, by states and governments. We know that he had a wife named Alice, and he had 3 children named Richmond, Eve, and Delia. Eve, I believe, had some health issues, and so he spent a lot of time helping her and raising money to keep her sustained. He's taken to work in Philadelphia to work at the White House, to work in Philadelphia at the president's residence there, and he entertains guests. He's known as one of the best chefs at the time. So while Washington was president, this is the man who was cooking for all those dignitaries, including Washington, John Adams, anyone you could imagine that are considered those founding fathers. But even having access to all that power, having access to the quote unquote luxuries of working at this high time of society, Posey liberates himself. We're about to celebrate President's Day, and President's Day helps honor George Washington's birthday. And so in 1797, Hercules Posey liberates himself on George Washington's birthday. So we're about to actually not only celebrate George Washington's birthday, but the liberation of Hercules Posey. He travels from Mount Vernon to New York, and there he resides. People do note that he is living there. Washington is unable to get him back. He refuses to return. And when Washington dies, he does manumission all the enslaved people on his property that he enslaves. Those do not include the dower enslaved people, which were enslaved people that came into the marriage through his marriage to Martha Washington. None of those enslaved people were manumitted. Unfortunately, Posey had to leave his wife and children behind. Alice was one of those dower enslaved individuals, and so she does not get her freedom. But he dies in New York in 1812, a free man. We do have accounts of him and how he lived, and the written accounts from George Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, who says, a celebrated artist, a highly accomplished and proficient in the culinary arts as could be found in the United States. So again, saying this man is pretty much one of the best cooks or chefs you will ever see or ever taste. Louis Philippe, the future king of France, says the general's cook ran away, being now in Philadelphia, and left a little daughter of 6 at Mount Vernon. Baudouin ventured, that's his assistant, that the little girl must be deeply upset. She would never see her father again. She answered, "Oh, sir, I'm very glad because he is free now." That's a question I get a lot of, like, did enslaved people bring their children with them? Do they bring their family? And how could someone leave their child, their husband, their wife, their loved ones behind? And oftentimes those families understood that only one person could make it out. Why have one person suffer for everyone? And he may have been planning to try to get the rest from enslavement before he passed away, but we don't know. But we do know his daughter said that she is happy that her father got his freedom, and he was able to be a cook there in New York. Thomas Jefferson also had an enslaved cook named James Hemmings, who was born in 1765. He was purchased by Jefferson James Hemmings is the brother of Sally Hemmings, which means he's I believe he's the brother-in-law of Thomas Jefferson as well. During the 1780s, Jefferson travels to France. He brings both Sally Hemmings as well as James to France with him. James was his cook, and while there, Jefferson sent him to culinary school, and he trained under the French culinary masters of that time. He also, while there, learned how to speak French and read in French. So again, he's definitely more educated than most Americans at that time. Is definitely more trained, more educated than most enslaved, the average enslaved person of his era. When he returned to the United States, while in France, he could have stayed. The French had outlawed slavery by this point in time, and so he could have, by French law, he could have petitioned to have his freedom. He did not. We don't know why. Neither did his sister Sally. But they returned to the colonies, or rather to the United States, and there he pretty much asked Jefferson if he could have his freedom. He said, can I purchase my freedom from you? And Jefferson makes him a deal. He says that if you train someone to be your replacement, then you can have your freedom. And so they travel back to Mount Vernon, and he trains his brother Peter to be his replacement. And he is finally manumitted on February 5th, 1796. Now, after he's free, he lives in Baltimore, so he comes to Maryland, and he lives in our home, and he lives in our state for some time. But when Jefferson's elected president, he sends an emissary to deliver a letter, he has an emissary write a letter to be delivered to Mr. Hemmings, and Hemmings actually says no. He says pretty much, why didn't Jefferson, if Jefferson really wants me, he can write himself. He can come to me himself and ask me to be his chef in the White House. And Jefferson's actually kind of taken aback by it. One, because he thinks in his mind that they are friends, that they've had a good relationship. Clearly, James Hemmings thought otherwise. They were not friends because one person was enslaved and the other was the enslaver. Although James Hemmings' family are still all back at Monticello on Jefferson's plantation there. Some are obviously going to be moving to the presidential residence where Jefferson will be living. He does cook for Jefferson one last time. In 1801, he travels to Mount Vernon to see his family, and Jefferson pays him, I believe, $30 to be his cook, or to cook for him during that time that he spends there. He leaves Mount Vernon, and about 2 months later, he takes his own life in Philadelphia. In Baltimore. Jefferson finds out while he's back at his residence as president. We don't know exactly why. The written records indicate that they say that it was alcohol that drove him to it. We do know that lots of enslaved cooks, as well as waiting men, people that were closest to white people, tended to, from these runaway ads and notes about them, tended to drink a lot. That may have been because of the stress. It may have been because they were dealing with their own traumas from being in such close proximity to these powerful white people who were enacting their own violence towards them, whether it was physical or emotional. But we do know that James Hemming took his own life in 1801, tragically. Cooking actually plays a role in enslaved rebellions. In Virginia, in 1800, there's a man named Gabriel Prosser who was partially inspired by the Haitian and the French revolutions that were going on during this time period. And he planned a revolt in Richmond, Virginia. The plan was to kill all the white people and create a government that was anti-slavery in what's now Richmond and that area. Two groups of people that he said that they were not supposed to be killed were the French. At the time during the French Revolution, they felt that they had common cause. The Quakers, because not all Quakers, but many Quakers were anti-slavery, and a woman named Mary Randolph. And we'll talk about why she's important and how cooking comes to play in this rebellion later in a bit. But it is said that this rebellion was to include thousands of people, but we don't exactly know how far and widespread this rebellion actually was supposed to be. A storm delayed the rebellion, and the militia was called up after people ratted Gabriel Prosser's how they revealed Gabriel Prosser's plot. So the plot was never carried out. The militia in the state of Virginia executed 35 freedom fighters, including Gabriel Prosser, who was executed in October of 1800. Now, how does that relate to cooking? One of the people that was on that list of people who not to harm was a white woman named Mary Randolph, who actually writes a book called The Virginia Housewife. Definitely check that out. It's a recipe book if you're interested in historical cooking and foodways. Mary Randolph was obviously an enslaver, but she also worked very closely with enslaved people. And many of those recipes are based on things that she would have learned from enslaved cooks. It is highly unlikely that she ever actually cooked herself, but she probably learned from these enslaved cooks and wanted to create some of these meals for other people. We don't exactly know why Gabriel Prosser wanted to save her life outside of it is said that he wanted to make her like the cook for his government, but her cooking must have been pretty good if he said, even though you're an enslaver, we need to save this lady's life, but kill all the other white people except for the French, the Quakers, and Mary Randolph. So her cooking, Southern cooking, enslaved cooking, would have saved her life had the plot had been executed. And then going on throughout America, the rest of the 19th century, cooking was a huge part of American cuisine. The American Civil War helped spread Black cooking throughout the country. African Americans, both free and enslaved on both sides of the conflict, are cooking in Civil War camps. I'll show a few pictures here. This gentleman right here, James Montgomery, is noted as a celebrated cook, and they're highlighted throughout Civil War art. And that legacy is being carried on by historic foodway chefs today, like Jerome Biles, who lives in North Carolina, Michael Twitty, who lives here in Maryland, Rufus Estes, a man who was born into enslavement and writes one of the first cookbooks. And he's a chef. He's also a Pullman porter. And his history is just amazing. Definitely check out his work and his cookbook. And then a new book that's been out, that came out, called Bound to the Fire, about enslaved cooking and American cuisine. I want to thank you all for joining me today. I know I've tried, I think probably gone a little bit long, but if you feel free to contact me, reach out. Here's my email address. Again, you can follow me you can ask me questions on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and let me know what you think. Thank you.
Okay, I'm looking to see, there were some comments. Okay, what countries and peoples in Africa eat okra these days?
Great question. Okra is big throughout West Africa, so Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Mali, Senegal. If you go even the Cameroon and Angola, so if you go throughout West Africa, you can still find lots of okra in these places. And those are just to name a few. Senegal, those are just to name a few places that okra is still being grown and used.
And another question, which foods were used for medicinal purposes by enslaved peoples?
Oh, that's a great question. So watermelon was apparently used by enslaved people They said that cured all kind of ailments, both by putting the rind on people, by eating it, as well as by putting it on people's like foreheads and things of that nature. So I'm not sure if that scientifically has been proven yet, if it actually works, because we do know there were things like leeching that were going on throughout the 18th and 19th century that we know historically don't really necessarily work as well as they were said to have worked. But watermelon has been used. Like collard greens and kale were used for obviously for eating, but also kind of helped with blood. People's like thinning out people's blood, and if people had different like arthritis, things of that nature. And then obviously okra was used not necessarily as traditional medicine, but also as birth control for enslaved women who wanted to use birth control.
From Council Member Jay Davis, can you explain how Hush Puppies got its name?
Yes, so Hush Puppies, that's a great question, come from the creation of cornbread and other corn based dishes. If you would have extras, you could roll them up into little balls, and usually the way that kitchens they were separated for the most part from the house. And so on the way, unlike today where people have dogs as pets, dogs for the most part, dogs and cats for the most part were tools on farms and plantations. So your dogs were out in the yard to scare away other animals. The cats were there to kill rats and snakes and mice and things. And so as the enslaved cook be walking, or the scullery maid, or whoever the waiter or waitress was in this house would be walking from the kitchen to the house, oftentimes they would carry these little balls of extra cornmeal, and they would toss them to the dogs to make those dogs stop barking and kind of go away from them while they were walking. And so that's kind of where the name Hush Puppy comes from.
It's interesting that you mentioned greens. We have a question. Do we know the origin of greens such as collards and kale?
Yeah, so greens and kale, they actually are grown throughout the world, but there are species of greens and collard greens and kale that are native to West Africa, specifically, I believe Nigeria and Ghana. And Benin, and those do come from there as well. Many of these foods, real quick, are survival foods. You see a lot of one-pot meals. So like collard greens are obviously usually incorporating, at least today, lots of bacon and bacon parts. Those parts are not necessarily pieces of the animal that would be traditionally eaten in Africa or in regular circumstances. But through enslavement, you are using what you have to make a meal. So when it comes to things like collard greens and adding in these flavors of different pork products, but also those leftovers to flavor it up, as well as adding, as well as foods like what is it? My grandmother was very fond of it. Chitlins. Like chitlins are not this; those are survival food that then become cultural over time. So when we think about how enslaved people are eating and what they're eating, and then what we're eating today, many of these ideas were both cultural, of what they're bringing over with them, and then how they're flavoring them based on the tools that they have become survival, and then later on they become African American cultural dishes.
Okay, there, in response to regarding medicinal food, Sandra has put in a contact. She said there's a great deal of information online. And I also want to mention about yams, because anyone, like my family's from Barbados and Latin America, you can go to any of the international Latin American food stores and buy a bunch of yams because they're sold there every day. Ronnie T, how often were Black communities connecting and shaping cultural elements with indigenous cultures and communities on the East Coast?
Well, that's a great question. So a lot of Native people, especially here in Maryland, like the Piscataway are a perfect example, intermarry with enslaved Africans and later on African Americans, and so there are a lot of crossover and cultural connections between these groups. Unfortunately, those connections sometimes start to get split up as time goes on, especially on the East Coast, especially where in our region, it's pretty early. Definitely by 1800, most Native people populations have been dispersed through war and genocide. Not saying that all Native people were removed. Still, there's very strong communities here in Prince George County, as well as throughout the East Coast. But by 1830, the federal government had really outlawed pretty much being Native and shipped off major Native tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And with them, they took some of those tribes, especially what they called the 5 civilized tribes, took with them their enslaved people. They practiced enslavement. And so if you look at their cooking, you will notice there are some Africanisms there. And even if you look at some of the spices that African Americans today use, like filet is a Native American spice, and filet is something that you can see it's in a very black dish, but it's a connection between those native recipes, and so you can't really separate African American foodways from Native American foodways from European foodways, because all of these cultures really blend together to make what we now know today as soul food, or even just American food in general. So that's a great question. Thank you for that.
And our Mayor Pro Tem, Kristen Weaver, you're going to meet her tomorrow. She's definitely coming to your demonstration.
Excellent.
There she is. Do we have any more questions? Yes, you got a lot of compliments. Very interesting presentation from Councilmember Davis. Thank you for adding this to our Black History Month programs. This was excellent from Cassandra Buffington Bates. Thank you, Marvin-Alonzo.
Thank you.
And I think on behalf of the Greenbelt Black History and Culture Committee, this has been a wonderful presentation. And I think a lot of us are gained much insights. And I wrote down the titles of the books, so maybe we can find some of them and have more discussions of this kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rosado. Thank you. Thank you all for attending today.
We got a new message. Oh, okay. One, really glad to have attended. I hope to contact you about some ways we might intersect our interest in service to a wider community. And this is from Sandra.
I would love that.
You'll be hearing from people, and you will definitely hear if we can do something for have your mobile van come for the Labor Day Festival. So we'll follow up with that, Leanne and I.
Oh, please do.
Thank you. And thank everyone for attending. I'm glad this was interesting to you. And I'm glad, Ronnie, that you gained a lot of knowledge. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. Hey, Carolyn.